Center. And today I am calling in from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm so glad that all of you decided to join us for this webinar about synthesis and thesis development. I think these are two really challenging aspects of academic writing, but they're so important. So I think this is going to be a really great webinar. So our goals for today's webinar are that by the end of the session, you'll be able to understand the role synthesis and thesis development have in creating an academic argument and developing your papers and thoughts. You'll be able to identify the essential components of a thesis statement and how to revise for those components, and then understand and implement the 3 steps that we use to help create effective synthesis. And so one thing to think about, and one of the reasons that I think synthesis and thesis development can be so tricky is because of what the goal is in academic writing. So when you're writing academically and you're writing papers for your Walden courses or for your capstone project or for your publications, you aren't just repeating what other people are saying. You're not just regurgitating information for someone else. You're actually entering a larger discussion with something of your own, some argument of your own, some purpose of your own. So that's why these things are so important, because we want to make sure that whatever it is that you're arguing or you're illustrating or suggesting, all of those things are going to be really clear to your reader. So we like to think of thesis and synthesis as connected, as interlocking. That's why they're both in this webinar today. We define the thesis at the Writing Center as a brief articulation of your paper's central argument and purpose. So basically, this is where your reader is going to be able to look and see, this is what this writer wants me to take away from whatever this piece of writing is. This is what they want me to understand. Your thesis is going to come out of the synthesis that you do. And we define synthesis as a way of presenting new ideas based on interpretation of other evidence or arguments. So your thesis comes out of that new idea, whatever it is that you have developed out of your research. And then again, it all circles back because that synthesis should support your thesis sentence. And that can seem kind of obvious, but it's just really important to look at how all of these elements work together so that awesome. So you guys were really fast in that, and I see some people are still entering their answers to the poll. But I think this is really helpful because for a couple of reasons. One, it lets me kind of know maybe why you decided to attend this webinar. The good news is we are going to be talking about all 4 of these things in the webinar. So hopefully I'll be able to answer some of your questions, or you'll be able to ask some questions of Sarah and Michael in the chat box. So that's helpful. And also I think it's really helpful for you to kind of think about this, because I think sometimes when we're writing, we can understand that we're struggling with something, but it's hard to pinpoint what exactly it is that's making this difficult. And so if we can think about that and put that into words, it really goes a long way to start working on developing those skills. All right, so thank you so much for participating in that poll. It's really helpful for me. The first part of thesis creating and synthesizing is actually the reading that you're doing prior to any writing at all. So this kind of seems like maybe a pre-step, but it's so important for both analyzing and paraphrasing and getting all of those pieces that you need to create an effective thesis and to effectively synthesize your information. So critical reading is all about interacting and engaging with the text that you're reading. So rather than just skimming over the words, or if you're ever like me and you're really tired and all of a sudden you find you're at the bottom of a page of reading and realize you've no idea what you've read up to that point, you're not critically reading. Critically reading is slow reading. It's really thinking about what the author's goal is, and thinking about how you are engaging in this larger conversation with whatever it is they're saying. And you can consider this in two different approaches. You can read the text as a judge of its scholarly value. So you can think about what kinds of pieces. One of my former students, I thought, described this so well, is that researching can be like detective work. And so when you're reading things, you're kind of being a detective. You want to look for all these pieces of evidence that are going to show you that this piece of text is a reliable source, that it's of scholarly value. So you might look at things like tone, you might look at things like how many good references does it have, how many good sources is it citing itself, and all of these different aspects that are really going to help you understand and for yourself judge that this is a worthwhile text for you and that it's a worthwhile text of scholarship. The second approach you can take is reading the text with your own agenda and your own thesis or theory or experiences in mind. And this is the reading that you're going to do if you already have a really clear idea of your thesis or of your argument or whatever the assignment is. You have a really clear idea of what your goal is. And so then you can do that reading with that goal in mind and be constantly thinking about how this information plays a role in your own writing, in your own goal. So that comes a little bit, that might not come right away if you're reading more so to figure out what you want to argue, but once you have that argument in mind, you can start thinking about that in your own, as you read about thinking about your own argument. And so we also have this link below for more critical reading tips because it is such an important part of academic writing. We've got lots of resources for you. So we're going to start out with thesis development. And just as a quick reminder, we define a thesis, and we call it thesis statement, purpose statement, argumentative statement, but we describe it as the brief articulation of your paper's central argument and purpose. So that's what the Walden Writing Center is defining it as. And there are three important characteristics to a strong thesis. So phrasing is short and to the point, or a concision. That you use appropriate detail for the scope of what you're writing, which is that making sure that you're being specific, and that you have a thesis that can be developed or argued against, and that meaning that it is arguable. So we'll talk about each of these three pieces on their own. So the first part is about being concise. So here's an example thesis statement that I might be working with. Walking at 3 miles per hour is a useful exercise that should be performed 3 hours a week to combat obesity in Toma, Wisconsin. So I have my thesis statement there, and I'm going to ask myself, does it include too much detail? Or is there any information that I might be able to leave out? So you can kind of think about that yourself with that thesis statement that I've just given you. And what you might come up with, or what I've come up with at least, is that it was a little bit too specific. So here I've changed it to walking a few times a week is a useful exercise for combating obesity in small communities. This allows you to branch out your research, perhaps if you want to talk about other communities aside from Toma. It allows you to consider maybe people are walking faster, maybe they're walking slower, maybe they're walking more or fewer times than 3 times a week. All of those things you're opening all of those things up for further discussion and for more information for your reader. You also want to make sure that your thesis is arguable. So you want to make sure, I think about this as like, is it an interesting paper? I tell my students, nobody wants to read a paper talking about how a specific wall is a certain color. I don't want to read a paper that thesis sentences, this wall is gray, right? because people aren't going to argue about that, and moreover, there's not really a reason to argue about it, right? So here we have this sample of walking is a physical activity. My purpose will be to describe this physical activity. And your purpose might be to describe a specific activity, but here we don't really have enough information to make this something that someone's going to either want to argue about, or really, I mean, if you can imagine finding this in a journal or finding this somewhere where you're looking for something to read, this is probably not going to jump out at you as something that you really want to think about or talk about. And so as I'm writing this and I look at this thesis, I might be asking myself, can I argue against this statement? Is there a counter statement? Or is there like a worthwhile counter statement? Because people can argue with anything, right? But we want to think about, is there something reasonable? Is there a discussion, an interesting discussion to be had here? Is the statement capable of advancement? Can it be supported? And thinking about, again, this is where that critical reading comes into play. Have I read interesting articles or have I read other interesting comments about this thesis? So instead, we can change it to weekly sessions of an activity like walking can help combat obesity in small communities. So it's clear that because we've used walking, right, we're going to be talking about walking, but we've, again, opened it up to some potential arguments. Maybe someone's going to say walking isn't a strenuous enough activity, so that wouldn't help combat obesity. Or maybe there's something about the small town communities that it would work better to do some other kind of physical activity. So we can have a little bit of more interesting conversation about this specific thesis and this arguable thesis. Because the next step is that it is specific. And I think this can be a little bit tricky because I've just talked about how you want to make sure you're being concise, right? So there is that balance that you want to draw between being concise and being specific. But in this example, we have walking is a useful exercise for combating obesity. And you might think about, is this really going to be a good argument? Is it going to be interesting? But what specifically can I develop here? Does the statement include enough details so that I can elaborate on my argument or I can develop this point further? Is it narrow enough for the assignment? Oftentimes what I see is students trying to write a 6-page paper on a giant topic. Like they're going to write a 6-page paper on cancer research or something like that. And that is just too broad. You could write, people have written dissertations on cancer research. So you want to make sure that you're allowing yourself an argument that is you're going to be able to follow through with in whatever the assignment is that you've been given. So instead, I might change this to weekly sessions of a low impact exercise like walking can help combat obesity in small communities. So again, we've broken that down a little bit. We've become more specific in what populations we're going to be dealing with. We're suggesting maybe, and like on the same time of that being specific, we're like opening it up to different kinds of exercise. So it's low impact exercises. Maybe I'm going to be putting emphasis on walking, but that suggestion of like walking allows me to maybe talk about some more pieces or bring in some more information. So here's a different topic, and I want you to write in the discussion box if you think this is concise, arguable, and specific. So basically, is this an effective have some differing opinions, but if we're looking at this as a thesis sentence and we want to consider concise, arguable, and specific, we might say, okay, this is pretty concise, right? We're talking about mobile phone use in college classrooms, so we're not talking about laptops or iPads or, music players. We're talking specifically about mobile phones, and we're talking about it in the college classroom. So we're not talking about workspaces or high school classrooms. We've specified that location and that specific element. So maybe it's concise. And then is it arguable? And this seems to be where people are having some discussion about whether or not it's arguable. Mobile phone use in the college classroom is a topic many educators are discussing. So this isn't really arguable, right? Because let's say I want to say, no, it's not a topic that educators are discussing. All someone would have to do to prove me wrong is show me a piece of literature where educators are talking about mobile usage in college classrooms. And there's research being done about this phenomenon. Is it good? Is it bad? So this is not really an arguable topic. And again, we might think about, is it specific? So it looks like it might fit the concise and specific, but arguable is where I think, and even because we're seeing that there's a lot of debate about whether or not it's arguable, I think suggests that we could make this into a stronger piece of statement. So thanks so much for participating in that. So we're going to move on to synthesis. And we want to remember that for our definition, we're going to be saying that synthesis is comparing different materials to highlight similarities, differences, and connections. You're going to be presenting new ideas based on interpretations of other evidence or arguments. And so here is kind of a little visual image of how to think about synthesis. So first we have these little dots, right? They're all separate. They're just kind of floating around. You're doing your reading. You're thinking about your own experiences and arguments. So they're all just kind of together, but they're all very individualized elements. So you, as the scholar, are going to think about all those different pieces of evidence and experience and evaluate them. So this step is kind of you processing all of that information. And then the third step is presenting the new idea or perspective or conclusion that you have created based on your understanding, your evaluation of all of these discrete separate pieces of information. So one of our instructors considered it as making a cake, right? When you're making a cake, you've got lots of different items. You've got eggs, flour, sugar. If you're like me, you have a box mix and some oil and eggs and maybe some water. And these are all separate things. But when you put them together and you put them in the oven, so think of the oven as your own analysis, as your own processing of all that information, it comes out with something brand new. Because a cake is different than eggs. It's different than oil and water. It's its own new thing. And that's what you're doing with synthesis. You're putting together these different ingredients and you're creating something new that is made up of all of these different ingredients, but that is completely different than any single one of them. So step one is paraphrasing, and I think my slides might have got a little bit out of order, but that's okay. So step one in synthesis is paraphrasing. And we want to think about, I just want to make sure that I didn't skip one. Yep. We want to think about why paraphrasing is so important. So paraphrasing, oftentimes in the Writing Center, we talk about how in academic writing, we recommend paraphrasing over direct quotation. And some reasons are because paraphrasing requires you to show to illustrate that you are conducting that critical engagement with your sources. You can't create an effective paraphrase if you're just skimming through the information and not really absorbing it. It helps to emphasize and establish your own voice as the author in your writing. So you want to make sure that it's your thoughts and arguments that are really at the forefront of your academic writing. And it also improves the flow and the transitions in your writing. And I think flow can be kind of one of those ephemeral ideas. We all want our writing to have flow, but it can sometimes be difficult to decide what that actually means. And so if you can think about flow as the way that a paper reads, if you're using a bunch of direct quotations, you're using someone else's voice and you're having to manipulate your own writing so that that quotation fits in. If you paraphrase, however, you're able to take that information and you're able to present it in a way that's going to be most effective for the argument that you want to present. And it's going to be able to kind of seamlessly fit into your own writing because it is your own writing. So in terms of paraphrasing, we break it down into a couple of steps. You want to read to understand, that's that critical reading. You want to write it in your own words. And this can be very tricky. I actually like to try to read something and then put it to the side so I can't see it when I'm trying to paraphrase, because I think it can be very difficult if you already have, somebody who's very smart, someone who has been published, so is probably a pretty good writer, who's written this information. It can be very easy to do what we would call a bad paraphrase or an ineffective paraphrasing, where maybe you're just switching out some words for synonyms, but you're not actually putting this into your own words and creating it and presenting it in a new way. And so again, maybe I've taken that original, I've put it to the side, I've written my paraphrase. Now I'm going to compare it with the original just to make sure I have in fact created an effective paraphrase. And that's step 4. You're going to look for borrowed phrasing if I'm too close to the original. And then of course you're going to cite, because even if you've paraphrased it completely into your own words, you still need to give credit to that original. These are some great paraphrases. And one thing I want to point out is that we have a lot of different paraphrases, right? You guys have taken this same quotation and you've put it into your own words. So naturally, that means that they're going to be different than what your colleagues are writing in the chat box as well. And so we just want to make sure that as long as we're staying true to this original, idea of the quotation, we're not taking it out of context. We're not trying to make the American Heart Association say something that it actually didn't say, that we're doing a nice job with paraphrasing. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, but thank you all so much for putting your information in the chat box. We're going to have another few options to do that too. So before we get into some of the effective paraphrases, which are probably going to be pretty similar to what you guys wrote in the chat box, I want you to consider this. So if I am trying to paraphrase this and I write something like, there are a lot of exercises out there, but walking has the smallest dropout rate of them all. It's the easiest good change you can make to properly develop your heart health, right? I've changed some of the words, and this is probably an over-exaggeration of what I sometimes see, or it definitely is, it's an over-exaggeration, but you can see how that's not really paraphrasing. I've replaced some of the words with synonyms, but I haven't actually taken that information and I haven't made my cake, right? That's still pretty obviously the original ingredient. That's not a very good, effective paraphrase. But here's some good paraphrase. Of all the ways you can get physical exercise, walking is one that people continue long term. I think I saw a few of you writing something similar. People can easily improve their heart health by walking. And although people can improve their physical fitness in many ways, one easy improvement that the American Heart Association reported people persist in the most is walking. So, and you can kind of decide based on what your specific goal is with your paper, your paraphrase might come across differently. So the next step is synthesizing. So when you're you paraphrased your information, but oftentimes, and for really effective academic writing, you're going to be taking multiple sources. You're going to be paraphrasing them so that they best suit your own paper, that they best fit your own voice. And then you're going to be putting those different sources together. That's the mixing of the ingredients to make your cake. So you're going to repeat the process of paraphrasing for multiple sources and ideas, and then you're going to use those paraphrases to put those different sources into a discussion. So here we have our original paraphrase, or one of our original paraphrases. Of all the ways you can get physical exercise, walking is one that people continue long term. And so I've read that American Heart Association article, but then I've also read this article by Prince. And according to Prince, I have this paraphrase. However, in the small Wisconsin communities she surveyed, Prince found that community leaders usually recommend group physical activities that result in short-term weight loss. So I put both of these pieces of information into my own words, and now I have to put them into a discussion with each other. Oops, sorry. And so that's where this however comes into play. And I think these transition words are also really important because those are allowing your reader to see how exactly you're putting these sources together. So I'm not saying of all the ways you can get physical exercise, walking is one that people continue long term, and in small communities, Prince found that community leaders recommend group physical activities, because Prince's argument is saying something that is not necessarily contradicting, but is presenting an argument against what the AHA has said. So I use that however to show that in the discussion, that's how these two are interacting with each other. So the second step of synthesis is to analyze. You're going to answer the so what question. You want to think to yourself, why is this information important? What does it mean? And why should we care about this information? What does the information show or tell us? So you want this information to be meaningful. You want it to have something relevant to your thesis statement that you're trying to argue. And so again, we have these two different examples that we've just combined, and we want to consider all of these different pieces. So a lot of answers, and they're a little bit different, some of them from each other. But what I'm not seeing is anybody saying that this doesn't matter, right? So I think that's a really good sign. We've got two pieces of information, and it seems like we can understand that there is some so what, so that we can get into more of that analysis. And I've seen a few people talk about how it helps put into context different situations. So a small community might be different than a large community. I saw someone write in about specific amenities that might be necessary. Maybe small communities don't have the same kinds of walking paths or the same kinds of facilities that a larger area might have. It's asking us to consider all of the different aspects of different physical activities. So great job. Thank you so much for participating. So we have that paraphrase originally, right? That's how we put those two things together. And our analysis, and this is what some of you wrote in the chat box, is thus community leaders are not following evidence-based methods when they suggest fitness methods that citizens are likely to continue. So that's going to be my new argument. That's going to be what I take out of these two separate pieces of information. And then you want to get into the conclusion. So you've asked the so what question in general, but now you need to, or sorry, you've asked the so what question specifically, but now you want to ask that more broad, more general question, so what? What point do you want to make about this information and analysis? What idea should the reader walk away from these sentences knowing? What broader conclusion or implication does this information have? So we have these two pieces or these two resources that we're putting into discussion. We've created our own argument that community leaders are not looking at the evidence-based methods. And so now we have to consider what I want to say, what the writer wants to say based on that information. So we're going to do another quick chat. Considering what we have here, what might your concluding sentence be? Definitely tricky because I think this is probably the hardest step of synthesis. And so one thing you might want to consider is what was our original thesis. Our original thesis was talking about walking a few times a week as a way to combat obesity in small communities. So remembering that that's our main goal, that's our main purpose, what might the final conclusion be? What might be nice job. And again, we've got some different options here because we might have different goals based on what the assignment is, based on what our own argument is about walking. So awesome job. And like I said, I think this is probably at least for me, the trickiest part of synthesis. So you guys are doing it on the fly, and that's very impressive. Awesome job. So here we have our three steps. Our paraphrase is coming at the top. We've given our analysis. And then the one possible conclusion might be, instead, community leaders should encourage walking programs instead of group activities with citizens' long-term benefits instead of short-term weight loss in mind. And I think I saw a few of you pretty much write that, but basically we're looking at these two pieces of evidence that have led us to see that community leaders are not using evidence-based methods, and this is our suggestion for what should happen, or this is what we want our readers to understand based on all this information we've just given. So like I said, I think synthesis and thesis writing is very tricky, and so oftentimes that's something that you get feedback on from either the writing center or from a faculty member or instructor. So they might not be worded exactly like this, but this is sometimes how that feedback can sound. At least to me, this is sometimes how it can sound. Is that there's too much opinion, there's not enough analysis. I don't care what you think, I don't care what you feel. And those can seem kind of harsh, but they are important things to think about when you are producing academic writing. So we have some great podcast episodes that you can listen to. We also have transcripts available if you want to just read them, but we have these what to do with negative feedback on your writing, and 5 tips for using writing feedback. I think it can be kind of scary sometimes to ask for feedback if we're not sure we know exactly what we're doing, or we're worried about how someone is going to talk about our writing. And so then when we get that potentially negative feedback, that can be very difficult to take. So we've created these podcasts to kind of help you work through that, how to make that feedback helpful for you rather than potentially hurtful. So these are some very common pieces of feedback that you might receive. Don't say I think or I feel in your academic writing. Instead, you can just take that out. You can just say, instead of saying I think walking could benefit many people struggling with their health, I can just write walking could benefit many people struggling with their health. It's clear that this is what I think because I'm the one who's writing it. And then if you think about citations and references and why they're so important, this is an example of why. That I think or I feel statement is implied by the fact that I'm not citing anybody else, that this is in my own paper, and I'm presenting this idea. Another common piece of feedback is to not include only analysis or only evidence, that they're both two important pieces of academic writing. So academic writing is evidence-based, meaning that all of your ideas need to be supported by sources, but you still need those ideas, right? Your paper shouldn't be completely filled with quotes or paraphrases from other people's writing, but it also shouldn't just be your own thoughts or ideas, because then it can seem like they're just opinions. It can seem like you don't have any research to back it up. So, and then again, don't include just sources. So when you're putting that paraphrase, or if you decide to use a direct quotation into your paper, you do need to explain what that information is doing for your argument. Why you want your reader to understand why you've chosen to include that piece of information, and why you've included it where you have, and why it's important for the argument that you're trying to make. So we have a lot of different resources. We have writing strong thesis statements and paraphrasing source information. So these are some webinars you can check out in that archive, or look to see if they're coming up. We have a thesis construction page. So that's a web page that's full of different resources for constructing an effective thesis. We also have a synthesis page. And then we have this blog post. I love this blog post. I think it's a really funny one. It's called "Argue is Not a Dirty Word." And so basically it's talking about how I think that misconception between putting "I think," "I feel" statements, trying to avoid sounding biased. Sometimes people can be concerned that, well, then if I can't sound biased, I can't argue, right? And this blog post really addresses some of that concern and that confusion. And it also does it in a kind of a fun and funny way. All right, so we do have some time for questions. And I want to point out that there is the writing support at waldenu.edu email address. So if you're watching the recording and you have a question, or if you come up with a question after the webinar is over, or even you just would rather.
Hey, yeah, great job, Casey. One question that I think the group could maybe benefit from would be regarding the meal plan paragraph structure.
That's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't get a chance to talk about the meal plan. So the meal plan is this kind of mnemonic device, or well, meal is a mnemonic device that we use to help us remember all of the really important parts of an academic paragraph. So we have a main idea, which is that topic sentence, that introduction to what this new idea is. We have evidence, so that's where your paraphrase is going to come in. Your analysis, so again, we had those two pieces of information that we paraphrased from different sources, and then we wanted to make sure we included some kind of our own thoughts, right? And then the L stands for lead out, and I think you can look at that in a couple of different ways, but that lead out is, if it's depending on where that paragraph is appearing in your paper, it's probably going to be that kind of what that main idea is from that paragraph and how it fits into whatever you're going to say next, that kind of transition statement. But you want to make sure that with that analysis part, you're giving that really clear conclusion, the bigger so what, the why this matters for my paper as a whole. And that can, depending on where it is in your paper, be that lead out, right? It's kind of reminding your reader what the bigger argument is. It's bringing back all that great information so that it connects really clearly to your thesis. And then, so again, bringing you into the larger topic.
Actually, I think you did a pretty good job of explaining that. Yeah, that's really the way that we think about the meal plan and incorporating synthesis as well. So yeah, cool. Other than that, I think we're pretty good in terms of questions that everyone could benefit from. Um, I'd like to say, thank you everyone for coming and